All right, everyone, welcome back to the first webinar for our fall 2022 series. We hope you all had a great summer. We missed you, and we are so glad that you are back with us today. In case you don't know who I am, I'm Sonja Hodis, one of the many directors at CCI Huronia, a condo lawyer, as well as your moderator today. And today's webinar is going to be a lively discussion about the global impacts on your reserve fund. There's a lot going on in the world today, and while it might not feel like it impacts us directly, the events around the world are having an impact on our daily life here in Canada, and specifically our reserve funds. Now, as all of you know, reserve funds are likely one of, if not the biggest item on your financial statement, and we plan for these reserve funds at least 3 years in advance, maybe 30 years or more. Just to make sure that there's enough money there to cover those major expenses when it comes to maintenance and repair of common elements. But what happens when a lot of things change in that 3 or even 30-year period? Are you ready for those changes? And if we just take a look over the last couple of years, just the last 3 years themselves, there's quite a long list of things that have changed in our world between inflation, a pandemic, the war in Ukraine, potential other wars, increase in the aging of our infrastructure, decreased labor forces, supply chain issues, increased oil and gas prices, situations like we've seen in Florida in June of 2021 with the Surfside condo collapse, and a move to onshoring, where we're seeing manufacturers now bringing operations back into Canada instead of having things manufactured abroad, which obviously there's cheaper markets abroad. So that's going to impact prices as well. So listening to this list can be overwhelming. I know when we were planning for this webinar, we were a little bit overwhelmed as we started talking about it, but we're not here to fearmonger today. What we're really here to do is just to have an open and frank discussion about how the realities of what we are all dealing with, what we're seeing in the world, is going to have an impact on your reserve fund. Talk about what people are doing right now, and hopefully when you leave today, you'll have some tips in your pocket about what you can do in the future. So we have a great panel of speakers with us today. They're going to bring us up to date on what people are doing. They're going to tell us whether the things we're doing are right or whether we should be changing them. So joining us today, we have Jessica Laker from Laker Property Management, Joanna Tomaszewski from Bayshore Property Management, Jeff Struewing. Britain got their new king, and so did CCI Huronia. Jeff is our new president, and he is the VP of Operations for Shorter Slope Property Management. We also have Mina Tesseris from Arbitect, John Juffs from McIntosh Perry, and Patricia Elia from Elia Associates. If you have any questions during the webinar, feel free to put them into the chat box. Our speakers will be looking at the chat box as we go through the webinar, and we're trying to answer those questions as best as we can. We also will have a question and answer period at the end of the webinar, and you'll be able to ask your questions there if you didn't get them into the chat box during the webinar. But before we move on, I would like to take this opportunity to thank some other very important people when it comes to our webinar series, and that is our sponsors. So thank you once again to all of our sponsors who have shown their support for CCI Huronia. Without them, we're not able to put on these webinars free of charge to you and have them running on a regular basis. So thank you to Common Ground, Condo Law, McIntosh Perry, and Bayshore Property Management. In case you don't know who CCI is the Canadian Condominium Institute, and we are an independent nonprofit organization that was formed in 1982. We are celebrating our 40th anniversary this year. We have chapters across the country, 8 alone in Ontario, and CCI Huronia is one of those Ontario chapters. Our main objective is education. However, we also advocate for condos, and we represent all of those involved in condos, from owners to directors to professionals, and we encourage all of these stakeholders to work together. If you're not a member of CCI, and you would like to be a member, you can go to our national website, cci.ca, to find a chapter near you, or you can join the CCI Huronia chapter by going to our website at ccihuronia.com. When you get onto our website, you'll see a link to the National Resource Center. You'll also see a link to past webinars where you can watch our previous webinars that we've been hosting over the last couple of years. And don't forget also to check out our newsletter, which is Condo Buzz, which is available on our website. And for those of you who are on Facebook, please check us out, like us, and join our Facebook page. Just a couple reminders. This video is being recorded, so if you don't want your image on the video, please shut off your camera. Please make sure your mics are muted so that we can get a nice clear recording for those that can't join us today. And moving on to our last disclaimer is just a reminder that the information provided today is general information and it may not apply to your specific fact situation. If you are a condo director and you want to use the protection of Section 37 of the Act, you need to get an opinion about your specific fact situation from your own professional. The webinar is not intended to provide you with opinions that will protect you under Section 37. In addition, the information provided today is current as of September 23rd, 2022. Things change rapidly, as we all know, so the information today may not be relevant at a future date. Please also be advised that any references to the Condo Act or other legislation as a reference to Ontario legislation. So if you're watching us from outside of Ontario, be sure to check your local legislation. All right, so before we hear from our speakers, I want to launch a poll to see what you think as an audience about what is the biggest impact on your reserve fund plan. So I'm going to launch the poll and we'll give everyone a couple, about maybe 20 seconds to answer it. So is it inflation, potential wars, pandemic, aging infrastructure, decreased labor force, supply chain issues, onshoring, gas and oil prices, or situations like the Surfside condo collapse in Florida? What do you think is the biggest impact? And if we haven't added it to the list, there is the other option that you can choose as well. All right, we have almost 60% answering. Get your answer in there. We're going to close the poll in 5 seconds. All right, this is your last chance to get your answer in there. We've got 80% answered the poll so far. So I'm going to end the poll and we're going to share the results. And for the purposes of the recording, I'm going to just read the results so that we have it recorded. So 54% of people chose inflation as the biggest impact. 27% chose aging infrastructure, 7% decreased labor force, 5% supply chain issues, and 5% gas and oil prices, and 2% said others. So it'll be interesting if you're one of those 2% that put other, maybe in the chat box, give us a list of what you think that other is. All right, so that's our poll. It'll be interesting to see how things change, if they change at the end of the webinar. So we're going to start off today with talking about what is happening in condos, and we're gonna go to the boots on the ground, our property managers, to find out what they're seeing with the condos that they're managing. So Jessica, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Good morning, everybody, or good afternoon, I should say now. Thank you for joining the webinar today, and thank you to CCI for inviting me. I'm going to talk a little bit today about what we call panic buying, or this phrase we've referred to this past short while ago. People are always afraid right now because of the times we're living in, the constant battle about purchasing as a whole. You know, are prices going to continue to go up? Are they going to go down? Should we wait? How does this impact the capital projects of the condominiums? So as a condominium property manager, you know, the boards have a lot of questions about, is now the right time? Is now the right time to do your roof? Should we move the project up? Should we wait? So there's a lot of uncertainty out there. And sometimes what we're finding now is there's this panic mode setting in, and people are starting to want to move projects up, but without necessarily always doing their full due diligence on how that's going to affect your reserve fund study, other projects. We're facing queries about, you know, is now the time to do it because the price of shingles in a roofing replacement, as an example, is going up. So maybe we need to jump on the bandwagon. Let's panic. Let's do this project right now because the costs are skyrocketing. So I've had some examples of some, you know, corporations that we work with where that's exactly what happened. Regardless of kind of the funds that were in the reserve fund, what the study was forecasted, their minimum balance, other expenditures, the panic set in and decided to move things up early. Well, sure, you could move things up early as long as you've done your due diligence. You've been very thorough in working with your consultants on how this will financially impact all the other components of your study. But unfortunately, there are some cases in which these projects have been moved up and then they're panicking because it's compromised the other projects. So, as a property manager, we give our guidance to the boards, we give our best suggestions, and some, are going to make the decisions based on kind of the fear factor. And suppliers are also doing this, I see, not all the time, and I'm not generalizing, but saying, get your project done now. There's another increase coming in 2 months. There's another increase coming in 4 months. And they put this fear. So, in talking about this today, I would say that it is key and super important to really do a full, thorough investigation of your financials, what's in your study. And if there's even a question, you can always do your study again earlier, and you can see how it would impact you as a whole. If you just go ahead and make these decisions without properly, reviewing what you have as a corporation, and if you're able to do this, then you could end up in financial hardship. You could end up with special assessments. We've heard in the news, I'm sure some of you have heard lately and in articles about various condominium corporations being faced with very high special assessments over, some capital projects and things being needed. In my eyes, with proper due diligence, that is avoidable. If things are done properly over the years and everybody is making sure that they're not rushing, they're not panicking, and they're properly thinking out what to do about their capital projects. Now, sometimes, moving it up is absolutely fine. So I don't want to get the message across today that don't move anything up, because your study is a guide. It's not verbatim of exactly what you have to do. So your study is giving you a hand in trying to figure out your major replacements and repairs of the common elements. But sometimes it really does make sense. I've had some corporations where, it might have been called for 2 years from now. They are concerned about the price. They have adequate funding. If they moved it up 2 years, it's not going to have a negative effect overall. So there are times where definitely that is applicable, and you could proceed to do that. My goal of the message today is don't have the fear of panic buying and jumping in right away to make a decision that could affect you negatively in the long run, and do your due diligence as boards, as managers, as contractors, to make informed decisions on all these major capital projects. And I know that Jeff is going to touch base later on, some ideas on how to purchase ahead of time and things like that could be beneficial. So that was my message for today, is just, don't be alarmed with the panic buying, and make sure you just thoroughly go through your finances before you make any major decisions for your corporation.
Thanks, Jessica. I guess we can start a meme that's stay calm and plan on.
Yes.
We'll make that the CCI meme for this month. All right. So moving on to Joanna. Joanna, what are you seeing with the condos you're managing?
So directly impacting us, and good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Sonja, and great recommendations, Jessica. As managers, it is our job to inspect the corporation's assets, be familiar with the reserve fund studies, advise the boards of upcoming repairs, and obtain quotes for the boards to review and approve. We see firsthand how the effects of the pandemic and many other current affairs have been impacting the cost and time of reserve fund expenditures. And during recently escalating prices, we have encountered situations when, after the board has approved quotes, the contractors came back advising that they can no longer complete the work as quoted due to an increase in the cost of materials. And I'll give you a couple of actual examples. In December 2020, the board of a large townhouse complex approved a quote to replace all back decks and privacy fences. The job was scheduled to start in May 2021. We've been hearing of the product and labor shortages, so we weren't too surprised when the contractor advised us that the job will be delayed by about a month. However, when the contractor advised that he can no longer complete the job as quoted, was in fact a surprise and a realization of the new normal we were dealing with. The price of wood products skyrocketed last year. The board was faced with two choices: cancel the job or agree to the higher price. The decks were in absolute need of replacement, so in fact, the board did not have a choice of canceling the work and had to accept the price increase. Soon, we all knew, it was all over the news, that in addition to the shortages, the cost of wood has increased dramatically. And thankfully, we are now out of the woods for supply, but the prices are still much higher than they were 2 years ago. So within a few months, a job that was supposed to cost $350,000 went up to $450,000 just because of the increase in the cost of material. Should the board have purchased the materials up front? Maybe, if back then we knew what we know now, and Jeff will speak more about that. Another example, another condominium, is about replacing front doors. Management obtained several quotes in late fall of 2021. It was getting close to the holiday season, so there was a longer break between the board's meetings, and it was about 2 months before one of the quotes was approved. Similar to the first example, the contractor advised that he can no longer install the doors as quoted due to a considerable price increase for the product. All contractors that provided quotes were contacted and had the same response. It appears that the popular phrase, quote valid for 30 days, has a new and very realistic meaning. Also, have you noticed your bills for large emergency repairs this year, like blown off shingles or aluminum flashing replacements? Even the cost of a boom lift rental appears to have increased by 30%. And these were just simple examples. What is more concerning is that the reserve fund studies completed prior to 2021 are based on lower prices. And we should all anticipate that almost anything in that reserve fund expense spreadsheet will cost more than forecasted. Recently, I've been comparing quotes received for garage doors, windows, and roof replacements with the existing reserve fund studies, realizing the enormous effects this inflation will have on the reserve fund balances, in turn resulting in considerable increases to contributions and risks of special assessments. So what can we do now to prepare the corporations and its owners? And resonating Jessica's recommendation, firstly, update your reserve fund study as soon as possible. Secondly, remember that the studies are based on existing materials, often build a grade. Let your engineer know if you are planning to replace parts of your common elements with better quality products that will work better and last longer, but will also cost more, because I've seen that happen as well. So plan ahead, talk to your manager, and utilize their experience with the unexpected costs. That's all for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. And I think that's like a really good sort of lesson that you're learning with your quotes lately is don't wait too long once you get the quote, because that quote is going to expire very quickly or change drastically if you wait too long to make those decisions. All right, Jeff, what have you been experiencing as a property manager on the ground?
We've seen a lot for sure with the volatility in the material supply and costs we've been experiencing the last 2 years. It's very important to plan well ahead for major projects. Be realistic and aware of the challenges. Consider pre-purchasing materials in advance, as both Joanna and Jessica have indicated. Some materials have very long lead times now. Others are more readily available and certainly at different times of the year. Purchasing materials in advance and timing the time of the year can save significant cost as the volatile prices continue to rise. It can also reduce a lot of headaches once the construction begins. For example, historically, pressure treated lumber costs are at the lowest in January and February. So if you're replacing decks or balconies that utilize pressure treated lumber, consider purchasing them in late December to end of February, and quite often you can save a fair bit of money in doing so. We are often seeing projects on pause, waiting for materials during the last couple of years as well. By having the materials in advance in a secure location, these delays can also often be avoided, which in many cases not only reduce the cost, but also reduces the inconvenience to the residents and the calls from the residents to the property manager and the board asking what and why is there no work being done. There are bound to be delays regardless due to labor shortages, weather, inspections by building department or consultant. So get ahead of this by sending out communications to the owners, set expectations, provide updates on progress, and anticipated timelines for completion. Make sure to include a disclaimer, weather permitting, and something about inspection process. We're seeing building inspections taking far longer to be completed. Even the issuance of permits, the 10-day turnaround for building permits has been obsolete during COVID and continues. We're seeing projects taking 3-4 months even to receive permits for. We've had several clients that have successfully purchased materials in advance and saved thousands, or in some cases tens of thousands of dollars in doing so. Purchasing that lumber in the off season, purchasing aluminum and glass railings immediately when the project is approved is huge savings. Aluminum and glass railings have not only been skyrocketing in price, but lead time now for glass railings is anywhere from 40 to 60 weeks, depending on the profile and the manufacturer. Some of the contractors doing the work also might have storage space for you. Other times they might not. Renting a shipping container or multiple containers and storing on site, if space permits, can provide secure storage of materials and reduce construction time as well, as the contractors don't need to travel back and forth to get materials. Having all the materials on site make that far more convenient for the contractor. And you also know that your materials are on site that you've paid for, and there's less concern that you've paid for something you haven't received. It's very important to include contingency funding and be prepared for material changes or substitutions for some projects. We're seeing quotes for projects valid for less than 7 days in the past year or so. As Joanna indicated, the 30-day validation for quotes is long gone. I recently saw a lumber quote actually for a project that was valid for 72 hours. It's really difficult for boards to review and approve quotes in that type of time frame. So allow for a contingency and expect a price increase when the quotes are not approved quickly. Contingency funds may also be needed for material changes and substitutions. Sometimes a product might not be available from a specific manufacturer for an extended period, but another manufacturer may have a suitable substitute at a higher cost. Depending on the product and the type of project, sometimes it's more cost effective to pay the additional cost for the substitute than it would be to demobilize and remobilize while waiting for original product. This is very important if heavy equipment, items like lifts or scissor jacks are required for the project, as there's often an expense for each day the equipment is on site. As Joanna indicated, those prices have gone way up. Large Zoom booms are up 30, 40, 50%, and the floating charges to bring it to the site and take it away have also gone up quite a bit. If your project involves a lot of aggregate, concrete, or asphalt, costs have risen sharply in the past 2 years, largely due to fuel costs and labor shortages. While gasoline prices have dropped significantly, diesel has not. All that heavy equipment, the dump trucks, the float trucks, the boom lifts, compaction equipment, and so on, all use diesel fuel. Many experts are indicating diesel will remain high, so there's little consideration to defer these projects and hope costs will decrease. They'll probably go up, so don't delay those projects. If you can afford to do them now, get them completed. Lastly, have lots of patience. There will be delays and there will be cost increases and overruns. Just a closing tip, when preparing the annual budget, consider increasing your reserve fund contribution to allow for the high inflation we're experiencing, which exceeds what most studies anticipate, especially if they're a year or two old. We're seeing new studies coming in with contributions much, much higher than the previous study. And that's a significant jump in the operating budget. If you can kind of bridge the gap and ease into it, it's less impact on the owners on their monthly maintenance fees.
And Jeff, you talked about storage and contractors maybe having storage, but you've had some interesting ideas, and some of your condos have been doing some interesting stuff in terms of storage. Do you want to share that? Because I thought it was a great idea.
Yeah, we've actually had a couple corporations utilize the shipping container sea cans. We've got two right now that are purchasing the sea cans, and they will store their materials for their project in those on site. And then they'll turn around and sell those sea cans and probably make a profit, and certainly not pay a rental fee.
Yeah, so thinking outside of the box is always, so to speak, is always a good idea. And trying to be innovative, especially in these crazy times that we're living in right now, is definitely going to see you get ahead of sort of what's going on. There's a question, Jeff, in the chat box for you. It says, you said there would be lots of delays. Do you have any ideas if and when those delays will begin to ease? Any thoughts?
The delays are caused by a number of things. Material supply chain issues have been a huge issue over the last couple of years. There's greater demand. People working from home or not working during COVID identified lots of projects around home that they wanted to complete. We have a reduced labor force that's affecting manufacturing and logistics. And then there's contractors that are hugely challenged by labor force issues. We've got a shrinking labor force, and it's making it a challenge for most service providers, but particularly in construction and home renovation. It's a huge concern. Most contractors are still dealing with staff absences as well due to either COVID or close contact. That's starting to ease off a little bit, but the staff shortage in general is not easing off at this point. If anything, it's actually getting worse. The labor force seems to be shrinking.
Yeah, so I guess the answer is I don't know. You don't have the crystal ball of when that's going to ease up. I don't know if any of our other speakers on the panel today have their crystal ball out and have any idea of when that is going to ease up. But if you do, put it in the chat box. And thanks to the property managers for just sort of giving us an update on what's happening with the boots on the ground and what people are seeing. Now we're going to switch things over and we're going to start talking sort of bigger picture of sort of what we can do. We're going to start with John Juffs, who's going to give us an overview of what a reserve fund plan is, just to make sure we're all on the same page with respect to why we have these reserve fund plans in the first place. And then he's going to go into a little bit more in-depth discussion about what is impacting those reserve funds. So John, take it away.
Thank you very much, Sonja, and thank you everyone for your time today. Happy fall. I guess we've started the next season in our cycle, so it's great to see everyone again, so to speak. I have the distinction, I guess, of being a reserve fund planner who was around through several variations of economic situations. Some of you may recall other presentations I've made where I point out that the cost of doing work in buildings has little bearing at all to the headline inflation. It has nothing to do with the price of broccoli or movie tickets. Those certainly trickle through the economy and, of course, do drive up costs elsewhere. But the costs of doing work in occupied buildings are going up for pretty much three big reasons: labor, material, and equipment. And we've heard lots of comments on all three of those so far. the thing about inflation is it's a given, it's going to happen. And what our various banks want to try and do is fight it by making sure that there are economic principles in place that keep inflation to a predictable and hopefully a predictably low level. In Canada, we have an inflation control target of 1 to 3%, and that's typically understood to be the headline inflation, but it's actually the core inflation. They take out the highly volatile gasolines and things like that and get to the core inflationary pressures. And that's what's driving the Bank of Canada nuts right now and the Federal Reserve in the United States. So what happens? There are various incentives that the Bank of Canada can provide the big financial institutions to lend money more freely and stuff like that, but that actually feeds into the cycle of inflation. So what do? They raise interest rates, and interest rates have a profound effect but a lead time effect on the industry that we're in. The last time we saw this was probably in 2008-9, and then just before that was in the combined recessions that we had in the late 90s, with Canada and US having lingering recessions and overlapped recessions. This costs a lot of money. Anybody who's renewed a mortgage lately knows that. Anybody who has a variable rate mortgage knows that. These costs trickle down and through and around the economy. The latest indicators from the Bank of Canada are that the inflation fighting measures in place will not drive us into recession. As you can hear in my voice, I have my doubts about that. I think between the Federal Reserve, various European countries, and Canada all fighting inflation at the same time, I think we are going to see a contraction late 2022 or throughout 2023, probably 3 or 4 quarters of contraction in a gross domestic product. What does that mean? Well, it means that there's going to be a reset of some sort. And so somebody asked a question earlier, when do we think the delays will be over? I think it'll be when late 2023 and early 2024 come to light, and people just realize they've got to get back in the game when we've perhaps established a little bit better and more controlled immigration policies so that we get skilled laborers again coming into Canada willingly, and we free up some of the production and productivity concerns. So, some of the effects of inflation are things like people will buy less or buy smaller, and that can have a good effect on your reserve fund plan, because maybe you look at a scope of work that's listed in your reserve fund plan and you say, well, we don't need to do a full scale replacement at this time. Maybe what we can do is some major repairs. And so you're buying a little bit less. Sure, you might have to do it a bit more frequently, but the good things about 30 and 45 and 60-year plans is you can build that frequency into your plan. And that will help. I mean, it's not going to be great. It's always a trade-off. Is it better to spend $10,000 every 5 years or $50,000 every 7 years? And so, people will argue about that math over and over and over again. But the reality is that's what boards are charged with the responsibility to do. Exercise your due diligence in studying that plan and understanding where the implications are, and stay in tune with your community needs and make sure that you're satisfying and everyone understands why you're satisfying their concerns with respect to inflation fighting measures. So this sort of quasi silver lining in all of this is, if you do have a reasonable balance and you've been doing successfully some investment and investment laddering, well, you're starting to realize finally some meaningful returns on your interest earnings. Not that this will ever save the day. You're never going to earn enough interest to, be able to replace a roof, but you're going to at least feel a little bit of an offset from the pressures that are otherwise occurring on the costs. That won't last. So as I said, I fully expect that we'll see in late 23, early 2024, a big reduction in the inflation fighting measures. The Bank of Canada rates will come back to, something sustainable. It'll probably keep inflation at the high end around the 3%. We may even see a steady 5% for a couple quarters. But I think on an annual basis, this time next year, we'll be saying, breathing a bit of a sigh of relief, saying, I think we can see that the light at the end of the tunnel is not an oncoming train, that there actually is room for future planning. So those are sort of my commentary on where inflation's going and how there is a small net benefit in the interest earnings. But there's no doubt that, our labor force in Canada is very difficult to attract to the condominium industry. You're competing with large infrastructure projects, and if a guy can get a carpentry job for $60 an hour on an infrastructure project in Windsor, he's going to go there, and he's not going to be replacing roofs in Collingwood. So that kind of competition is difficult. But I think the sort of elephant in the room when it comes to labor is baby boomer. Baby boomer is retiring and dying, and they were the largest part of our population for a long time. And that, baby boomer gets what baby boomer wants. Well, baby boomer wants a nice, relaxing retirement where other people shovel the snow and cut the grass. And that's going to be difficult to do if we don't start back with large immigration policies. That's easy to say. We also need to have home building happening at a large rate to accommodate that influx of immigration. And so you can see the spiraling, competing challenges of these things that we have. But it is in no small measure in response to baby boomer. The other problem is we have this strangely slow uptick in trades, despite all of the efforts made by the various trade associations and our education system and so on. The trades are having trouble attracting people, both men and women, and both skilled and willing to apprentice and so on. And so if we don't see a change in that soon, we're going to rely on overworked and have to schedule ourselves in around some very strange, labor availability. There's been much talk this morning and excellent points made on material and how possibly, buying materials in advance can save you that cost increase. And I think those are wonderful ideas. And if you can do it, do it. That's really good advice. Supply chain disruptions, we've suddenly realized that this just-in-time delivery of stuff from foreign lands leaves us at a disadvantage. And so bringing production capability back to North America and Canada is a good idea. It sounds protectionist, and I suppose it is a little bit, but it's a good idea because it allows us at least to deal with transportation that isn't, international and is on land or, readily accessible waters. So I point to this regularly. We have a caulking manufacturer that was struggling to get his caulking materials out into the Canadian marketplace. And then when the pandemic hit, and in particular, caulking materials weren't available from China, his business soared. And he's based in Montreal. He's now opening another plant in, I believe, it's just outside of Winnipeg. And he's, jump-started his business and taking on all kinds of new, employees and salesmen and contractors are reaching out to him. His products are good. They're a little bit more expensive, but they're here. They're readily available. And so he's doing a good job. The other interesting one was we had a plant fire in Texas. I think it was in 2020 or 2019. And the plant fire, oddly enough, was a chemical plant that produced pigments for colors. These colors are used in everything: car paints, interior paint, exterior paint, coloring of various modules and things like that. These pigments, without them, you were getting beige, and lots of people don't like beige. So they're having to wait to get their pigmented product, whatever it might be, including caulking. And so those sorts of things, are a challenge when you have one large manufacturer supplying, and I forget what the numbers were, but staggering. It was like 60 to 70% of the marketplace's color came from this one plant. And I think it's only just recently gotten back up and running, and it's certainly not at full capacity yet. So we'll see where that goes. The other of the 4 points I mentioned, inflation, labor, material, and equipment, is the equipment aspect. You don't want to have equipment sitting around on the job site for a long time, but by the same token, you want it to be available to you. And how do you do that, right? In some cases, you get people buying the equipment. So you might get a contractor saying, hey, in order to do this brick job, I'm going to need this lift for several months. It's an $80,000 lift. I can't run the risk of not having it available and still meet the deadlines. will you partner with me on a purchase and sale? Split it 50-50 and buy the $80,000 piece of equipment and then sell it later on, and at least make your money back, or hopefully not lose too much. And in the case of the C-can containers, you probably will make your money back and make a profit. So don't be afraid of some unique partnerings like that. Don't get too far into the weeds of what the contract says. Contractors shall supply all equipment necessary. There might be some unique situations where you might want to consider it an investment in getting your project done. I'll just finish off with sort of an exercise. I'll describe to you an exercise I had dealing with the CIA, not that CIA, the Canadian Institute of Actuaries. These people are brilliant number crunchers. They can twist and torture data in a way that is just unexpectedly refreshing. So they took 300 of our plans and created a townhouse model and a high-rise model, and looked at them and sorted and twisted the data and said, really there's two important things here: the cost and the time to failure. Costs are predictable but variable, and they seem to always be a little bit more than actual. So they put a Weibull distribution to it instead of a normal distribution. They put a Weibull distribution. It's called tail to the left distribution, so that there was an uncertainty created to that. And then they added to it any of the individual components on the lists. They said, the time to failure, some things last longer and some things last shorter. It is within a relatively close time frame from what the predictions are. And so they put a normal distribution on that. And then they ran 1,000 different random variables of that Weibull and normal distribution on the cost and the time. And they said, what's the likelihood of costs exceeding contributions? In other words, a special assessment being required. And they found that there, in 30-year plans, relatively no, like 3-4% chance risk. But in 60-year plans, much higher risk. And of course, in a 100-year plan, a very much higher risk, all the way up as high as 40% in some cases. So what does that mean? Well, when you think about it, your reserve fund study is a living document that keeps on rolling forward 30 years every time you do it. So if you're planning on living in a condo for 30 years, you should be looking at a 60-year plan, because you want to reduce the risk of that surprise, especially at the tail end of your occupancy. So these sorts of things, need closer scrutiny. And, it's important that we look at that, not in a fear-mongering sort of way, but in a realistic, understood kind of, we know the risks are there. What are we doing to actually address the risks and do our due diligence when it comes to reserve fund planning, by relying and standing shoulder to shoulder with your professionals to make sure that the community at large understands that you're not just taking money from their pocket, you're actually investing in their largest investment. Most people's homes are their largest investment, and you're looking at your reserve fund plan as an investment in that asset, not a unsatisfactory cost to you every month. I'm sure I've gone well over time. Thank you for listening to my ramblings, and I'll turn it back to you, Sonja.
Thanks, John. So here's a question for you. We heard the property managers all say, look at your reserve fund more frequently than the 3 years that we're supposed to be looking at it. And you talked about, planning 30 years in advance. So as a reserve fund planner, what's your view, given the current climate that we're dealing with? Like, should condos be looking at their reserve fund earlier than 3 years, or should they just stick to that 3-year schedule? What are your thoughts?
I feel the 3-year schedule is sufficiently frequent. However, a small caveat there. 2 things. If your balance is way different than what the prediction was, so say 50% of what the prediction was, and you have no good explanation for that, well, then you need some help. So yeah, do an early update. And secondly, if the spending is significantly different than anticipated, such that you would end up in a negative balance, or that there's a fear that you'll be wasting time to do your catch-up funding, instead of increasing fees by $10 and increasing them by 12. So except for those 2 caveats, I feel the 3-year cycle is enough, but you do need to recognize, as Jessica, Joanna, and Jeff all pointed out, the cost predictions were based on old numbers, old, much lower numbers. And so when the number comes in higher, ask yourself, do we have the buffer? Do we have enough money in reserve to avoid going into a negative balance? And then ask the reserve fund planner, knowing what we know now about the costs, what does that mean for the recurrence of this? Are these materials not just expensive, but maybe longer lasting? And if that's the case, then there might be a benefit there as opposed to a detriment. But if these are short-lived and high-cost items, then there's definitely a detriment there because the frequency will be increased. So I do feel the 3 years is enough. Many jurisdictions have 5-year cycles, Alberta being one. So, it's not a outrageously long time. I feel it's a little bit long time. What I do rail a little bit against is waiting 6 years for somebody to actually come and look at your site. And you mentioned Surfside earlier in the opening remarks. They had people there practically every year and did nothing. I'm shuddered, and I hope that I never find myself in that situation where clients just ignore, needed repairs. So waiting 6 years in some environments, especially in harsh northern environments, might be pushing it. You might not even know that you have a problem until somebody with an experienced set of eyes comes and looks at a stain and says, that stain is a symptom of a really big problem. We've got to get acting on it now. So you see how that goes, but I'm okay with every 3 years.
All right, thanks, John. And there's some comments in the chat there that you might want to take a look at and reference to. But Jeff made a comment about, would it not make sense to reconsider the 3-year rule? And just for everybody, just to remind everybody, that 3-year rule is a legislative minimum. It's not a hard and fast rule that you only must do it every 3 years. It's just a legislative minimum that it has to be done every 3 years. So we've had some discussion today about whether you should do it earlier or not. But just remember that's a legislative minimum. Okay, so thanks, John. So let's move on to our next speaker. And we've got Mina, who's going to get more into the CCDC contracts and price escalation and contractors. So Mina, take it away.
Thank you, Sonja, and thank you to all the speakers who have given some pretty great tips up until now. The property managers, thank you for all those tips. Some good information there that I think we can all learn from. Today, I'm going to talk about how to try and manage the risks of inflation in your construction contracts. And so the way in which what we're currently seeing in the market is price escalation clauses being added to CCDC contracts. For those that may not be familiar with the term, a CCDC contract is the standard form of contract that we commonly use in Canada for larger construction projects. Currently, the standard form of contract does not include price escalation clauses. The inflation that we're seeing now is historically high, and it's never really been an issue for owners and contractors. Typically, up until pre-COVID, most of the time when a contractor submitted a bid, that was the price that the owner would pay with some adjustments for change orders and that sort of thing. But generally speaking, very seldom did we see contractors coming back to the owner and suggesting that they couldn't complete the contract because of huge escalation in pricing that was beyond their control. And now, as some of the property managers have indicated, that's a reality. We're seeing that often on construction projects. How long that's going to be around is anybody's guess. Personally, I feel we're dealing with a bullwhip effect from COVID, and that's just slowly working its way through the system with all the supply chain issues. Hopefully, it's not around for very long, but this is the situation that we're dealing with now, and that's what we need to react to. And so one way of addressing those issues of price escalation is to include price escalation clauses in your CCDC contracts. This is a fairly new concept, but we are seeing that in construction contracts currently. I've seen numerous articles by construction lawyers with various terms and clauses that can be included in your construction contracts to deal with price escalation. Typically, where you include those price escalation clauses is in what are called the supplementary general conditions of your CCDC contract. So the CCDC contract is split up into what are known as general conditions, which are standard clauses in the standard form of contract. And sometimes an owner will include what are called supplementary general conditions, which supplement the standard clauses. And so as an owner, you can make those supplementary conditions whatever you want. Whether a contractor will sign that contract is another question, but those supplementary general conditions are to supplement the general conditions of the standard contract. It's a very good idea. In fact, you should have any supplementary general conditions reviewed by your lawyer if you're going to be reusing them over and over again because it's a contract. And so there are legal ramifications to supplementing or changing the general conditions. But these price escalation clauses will typically deal with escalation, unforeseen escalation, or excessive escalation of costs in labor, materials, and energy. And those clauses can take a different form or many different forms. I've seen very simple escalation clauses that are a paragraph long. And there are, on the other side of the spectrum, some very complicated price escalation clauses that include things like indices for the commodity that you're dealing with, be it asphalt, concrete, that sort of thing. And so the escalation clauses, what they do is they provide both the owner and the contractor with a means for negotiating a change in contract price when the price of the materials or the labor or energy in the contract reach a trigger point. For example, if the escalation clause says something to the effect of the escalation cost is triggered when the asphalt index increases by more than 15% of the base bid in the contract, then there will be a negotiation of the contract price for the asphalt. And this is the process that will be used to negotiate that new price. And so the process requires effort and trust between the owner and the contractor, and bargaining in good faith when those price escalation clauses get triggered. And so I think what we're going to see is the contractors with a good reputation for fair practices are the ones who are going to continue to rise to the top, and those contractors that really haven't with unfair practices are the ones that are going to suffer through this sort of an environment. One very important point to make when you're including price escalation clauses, or even if you're not including price escalation clauses, is to give consideration to your price breakdown in your contract. It's very important to have an itemized price breakdown in your contract, because that itemized breakdown is that's your starting point. That's your baseline for determining whether or not price escalation has occurred. If you do not have a itemized price breakdown, then it's anybody's guess as to whether or not the contractor's claim for an increase in cost is valid or not. So that's a very important point to make. I'm going to leave it at that. I know, Patricia, you have quite a few comments and points to make as well on this topic, so I'll hand it over to you. Thanks very much, everyone.
Okay, great. Is that all right, Sonja?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
Actually, there's a question in the chat about what would the escalation clause entail in order to protect corporations against high increases. And the person's looking for examples, so that's a perfect lead into your presentation.
Okay, well, I would suggest your lawyer probably can advise on that because, as Mina said, it's going to also depend on what type of contract you're looking at and what would be appropriate for that contract. But the CCDC is always a good place to start. Always make sure you start with the actual true CCDC. What we've been seeing in the industry is that people are modifying the content of the CCDC and people aren't aware of the modifications. So the supplementary terms are where the magic should be in terms of meeting today's economy. So everybody's done a great job of advancing all the interesting challenges that we have created as humanity. And I think, though, there's time for some good news too. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development has a great website which talks about the economic forecasts of many countries, and Canada is there. And what's good is that our real GDP is scheduled to grow by 3.8% in 2022 and 2.6% in 2023. So what that means is we're going to have good positive outcome in real numbers. And that means Canadians are working hard. We are busy. We have pressures on supply and demand chains. And you can ask any property management company, how easy it is to hire property managers onto their team these days to understand supply and demand effects. But with that said, I think, we are an economy that has very good infrastructure, lots of good things about our country that we can step up into these challenges and as well acknowledge what our actions are doing. So if we buy from a local business, and I think in Huronia, for example, we like to buy locally, it comes with the Ontario and Canadian framework for legal parameters. So that will escalate costs, but you are supporting local jobs. As well, the cost of living for people who work in the condominium industry is going up just the same as yours. So you can expect increases on the operational side. But when we get to the contracts, this is where I think it's really important to get specific and be, less ambiguous and use data and do that due diligence. The first thing I'm going to suggest is that you put all material contracts in writing. Purchase orders are good for some things, but they don't really go the distance on the bigger contracts. The CCDC, as mentioned, is very good because it is comprehensive. And that's what I like to see, but it it should be tweaked, especially in bigger projects that are going to run for long term. For example, 2 seasons, 3 seasons, we're seeing that for certain types of projects like townhouse window replacements. I've just had a client that finished one. It was 3 years and it was over $8 million, but it was 345 units, each with like 13 windows each at a minimum. So it was big. But in those type of projects, you really need to think about the price escalation clause. You need to think about things like storage, production, labor, and really manage how those things are going to be dealt with. Timeframes for performance should be tight and as reasonable as possible, allowing for termination as well during the phases. So what we've started to do is actually do multiple phased contracts for larger projects so that the corporation can also, if they need to, stop the project midstream. Warranties and covenants. Sometimes we don't pay a lot of attention to that, but they should be really refined, clear and concise, and enforceable over time. One thing to consider is whether or not insurance will still cover the corporation if installation is not in line with manufacturer warranties. Who is going to sign off on the fact that guidelines for installation have been affected? Sometimes people are dropping the consultant. I would recommend not dropping the consultant. I would ensure, though, that the consultant's review of the project ensures that there is compliance with manufacturers' installation guidelines. because when the shingles blow off and insurance says there's no coverage because they weren't installed in accordance with manufacturer's guidelines, it's going to be too late for that engineering opinion. As well, the agreement should make sure that that is articulated. With respect to the agreement, also insurance, do your service providers have the right type of insurance, adequate insurance, and whose insurance is going to respond first? Now what we're trying to do is actually make the supplier's insurance respond before the corporation's insurance does, which helps manage the cost of insurance. Dispute resolution. How can small disputes be dealt with cost effectively? We need to de-escalate conflict. And sometimes what you can do with these projects is put in place disputes under $5,000 are going to be determined by somebody who's pre-designated in advance. The parties both like each other at that point. They can agree on somebody who's going to do that dispute resolution. And what that means is that the project is not stalled. And so you keep on that time frame. As well, in this environment, you may also have to think about what happens in the event the supplier goes bankrupt. What is your solution? What is your go-to? And what are your remedies? So you may take more time looking at what bankruptcy means and what does default mean as well. Do you give somebody another kick at the can to rectify it, or is it automatic right of termination? So at the end of the day, your contract it should be something that embodies risk management that avoids these scenarios, losing great contractors because of economics. So what is the cost of getting the work done really well? As well, avoiding a scenario where the costs of the contract exceed the profit. I've had this situation recently, so it was more cost effective for a contractor to walk off the job midstream. And this is a multi-million-dollar contract. And, again, thinking about difficult termination provisions, think about termination in more simplistic and stepped ways. And then as well, making sure that the contracts are within reasonable timeframes. Because the longer the contracts are, one of the challenges is that you're going to be subject to the impact of all of the different forces that we've talked about, because they will be coming through the system. If I look at the cost of oatmeal, it's gone up 23%. So the other thing is to choose your priorities. Think about what should come first. Can you put off the carpeting and the refurbishment of the hallways? Instead, do the guts of the building, do the risers, do the things that are really important, and reprioritize your money. So at the end of the day, I do think that the lawyer is one of the good people to talk about the positives of how we can get through this. But I think we can. I think it's key to just keep calm and carry on and do what we've been doing. That's it, Sonja.
Thanks, Patricia. And, both of us are lawyers, so it sounds like we're tooting our own horn. But at the end of the day, this all comes down to a contractual relationship, and those contracts are so important. And it's a lot easier to put in place ahead of time things to protect the corporation than to have to fight it afterwards. So it's probably money well spent up front to make sure those contracts are as favorable as they can be for condos, given the situation that we're dealing with. So here's a question for Mina and Patricia. Feel free to jump in with your thoughts as well. But it was early on in the chat box, and I thought this would be a good time to sort of bring it up. Jared said that when he was a condo president in Toronto, they had a consulting engineer on retainer for the purposes of assisting with technical knowledge, preparing RFPs, supervising major and structural projects. Do many engineering firms offer this service for condominium buildings in this area, in our area, in Huronia? And he's talking about beyond just the reserve fund study, more of a partnership. So first of all, maybe Mina, you could talk about whether you see that existing, and Patricia, maybe you could give your insight on whether you think this is a good idea for condos to consider. Mina?
So thanks, Sonja. I think certainly most engineering firms, and I know of a few in Huronia, would provide that service. And I do think that it's a very good idea to establish a relationship with your consultant, because history is a very important part of maintaining an asset like a large building. When you have someone involved that knows the history of your building, the learning curve is very, very short. So I do think that that's definitely a service that you will find consultants will provide. I think now more than ever, it's really important to establish that relationship, because earlier we heard some of the speakers talking about perhaps doing your reserve fund in advance of when it's due, or looking into deferring projects or moving projects up. With the assistance of a consultant, you can make better decisions, in my opinion, as a board. And also relying on that professional opinion protects you from the liability associated with making a large decision like that. But working with your engineer to look at ways of perhaps either deferring work if it makes sense to do so, or using materials or using solutions to your major repair and replacement projects that make sense, that will save you money. That's where an engineer can really help. And so I do believe that now it's more important than ever to be looking at those options, to fine tune your reserve fund studies, to fine tune your capital replacement plans, and try and take advantage of what a good engineering firm can offer, because you're paying some money up front, but when you're talking about large contracts in the hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars, that's a very, very small sum to pay up front.
Thanks, Mina. Patricia, should we be adding the consulting engineer to the team up front?
Absolutely. Absolutely. From my experience over a couple of decades now, I've seen the value that they bring, because they can be proactive. And Mina highlighted the need for relationship, trust, legacy. But I would also add to that in different ways is data management and critical thinking. I think that's what your consultant brings to the table in order to give you a big picture on your capital assets. So that reprioritization can be done on a foundation of logic and science as well. You need that expertise. I've seen condos drop the consultant and go it alone, and it actually escalates the cost at times on larger projects. And so it didn't end up saving money, it caused more chaos.
And for the property managers on the panel, John and Jessica and Joanna, what are you seeing? Are condos using this in our area? Are they using the consulting engineers at the front end to help sort of work on a long-term basis with the condos?
Absolutely.
Sometimes. I mean, I'm going to be the honest one. We might make recommendations. It doesn't mean it's always utilized. We make suggestions of it because I think it's a good practice. Because a lot of people want to try to look at the numbers themselves, look at the plans themselves, and it might not be their area of expertise. So we encourage it, but it would be nice if it did happen more than not.
Comes down to the particular client and the types of projects they have.
Exactly.
In
it's dependent.
Immediate future. We've seen, especially in the last year or two, more cooperation from condo boards or agreement to utilize the consultant on the large projects, mainly because of the tendering process, the shortage of contractors, making sure there's performance clauses in the contracts, and even in looking at different materials and what the component inventory would be between the types of materials. Prime example, we had a condo that every 12 years was replacing asphalt shingles on their roof, and recently switched to a metal roofing system that has a 60-year finish warranty on it. alleviates that replacement every 12, 15 years, which has huge impact on in this case, it's a hotel condominium. So the guest impact is drastically minimized in doing that. So it's paid off well. The board was fanatics over gaining those economies of not having to do the every 12, 15 year replacement, but also the rental manager in partnership with the Condo Corporation was ecstatic about it as well, because it's reducing guest impact overall, not just to that hotel, but the four that surround it.
John,
Yeah.
don't mean to leave you out there. What are your thoughts on it?
No problem. I didn't feel left out. I was just waiting my turn. I think it is important to develop a good relationship. I don't know that it's necessary to go so far as to have somebody on retainer, as much as I'd love to have a monthly retainer to be at the beck and call of a board. I feel like I am anyway for all of our clients. So the importance of having the legacy knowledge of what was done can't be, underrated in any way. It's the sort of thing that, and I think it was Mina who said, you eliminate the learning curve. If you opinion shop and go around and try and get the least expensive consultant, you might not get the best, information being transferred from hand to hand across about the problem solving techniques. I'll just relay a quick story. We had a client who received and implemented the reserve fund study that we prepared, and then came back to us saying, your numbers are all wrong. We just got the quotes done, and the contractors are all coming in much, much higher than expected. And of course, everybody in my office kind of rolled their eyes and said, well, what do you expect? We're living in supremely high inflationary times. I said, well, let's dig into it. Let's get into the weeds and see what it was. And it turns out the scope of work was entirely different than what was carried in the reserve fund plan. The scope of work in the reserve fund plan was to waterproof balconies, and what they were doing was tearing off guards, placing caulking, replacing brickwork near the balconies, not on the balconies, and so on. By the time you got the scope of work narrowed down to what was actually in the reserve fund plan, it was remarkably accurate. It was within like 8%. So, it was one of those things where had they continued the relationship with the reserve fund planner and tendered the work via the skill set of the reserve fund planner, they would have made sure that the necessary scope of work was implemented so that it could be readily afforded without all the anxiety of, costs are much higher and so on. So yeah, build those relationships. If you want to consider retainers, sure, but build the relationship first and make sure that you've got a trusted partner in all of the various professionals that can help you solve problems.
Thanks, John. And, I think that's one of the key takeaways is about building relationships. We need relationships to be able to have people to go to when, you're in a crunch or you're in a crisis. And if you've built those relationships up, you've got those people who are already in your corner. And so a lot of condos, we're always looking for where's the cheapest. Who's the cheapest at this point in time? But going by price and looking always for who's the cheapest and moving from one to another because they're cheap doesn't help build those relationships. And it's really hard when you're in a crunch then to be able to reach out to someone because you haven't built that relationship to begin with. So I think that's a really key point that we can take away from this. Before I move on to some other comments in the chat box that I think that are interesting. I just want to remind everyone that this is your opportunity to get your questions into the chat box. We have a little bit of time before the webinar ends today to try and answer those questions. So if you have a question, put it in the chat box and we are going to do our best to try and get to them. Thanks to Jim for his comment in the chat box. And there was some chatter back and forth in the chat box about this, but I just wanted to put it on the recording and to make sure that everyone could see it. He made a comment about, when you're in the planning stages of completing your reserve fund study updates to determine when and what projects will be completed in the near future, it's important to carry out condition surveys of various components to determine whether items can be pushed out or may need to be moved up. And I think John agreed with him and some others agreed with him. So thanks, Jim, for that comment. In terms of tips, I want to just go through the panel, and we always like to end our webinars with a tip or some kind of takeaway. So I'm going to go through the panel, and what do you want to leave our viewers with today on this topic? And John, I just wanted to take a couple minutes before we go to the tips to just make sure that everyone understands sort of what the reserve fund study is, because we had a couple questions in the chat about this. So this is just like sort of back to basics. Why do we have a reserve fund study? What is the reserve fund versus the reserve fund study? And what are the legislative minimums?
Sure. There are three things that are required under the Act. You need to have a fund, you need to have a study, and you need to have a plan. So the fund is easy. It's a bank account. It's a separate bank account. And if you have more than one, it doesn't matter. They're all, if they're for repair, if they're for replacement or major repair of any kind of the common elements, it doesn't matter how many funds you have, they're all part of the reserve fund. So most corporations have one separate bank account. So that's the fund. It's the place where the money is. The study is an analysis, both physical and financial, of the common elements. Under common elements are everything outside the boundaries of the units, all the jointly owned or commonly owned property. So we've mentioned many of them today. Roofing is a typical one. Windows might be one. Balconies, parking lots, underground garages, all the things that go into that provide service to more than one unit. That said, there are exclusive use common elements like balconies and patios and so on, and decks, but they're still common element, even though they're the exclusive use for one unit. That study looks at the condition of the materials and the age of them, and what, are they even possible to replace anymore, or does some change have to be made? And then sets out a number of things like the year of acquisition, therefore how old it is, and based on experience looks at the normal life and says, okay, history has shown that the roof shingles are being replaced every 12 years, puts that into the study, and then creates a big long table that has annual expenses associated with it. And hopefully those expenses are being inflated at something greater than headline inflation, because experience has shown that cost of doing work in buildings is typically in the range of 2 to 4% more than headline inflation, which is bad news when headline inflation is so high. So once you have all that laid out, you now know what your spending pattern is. You might take a fine-tooth comb and look at it and say, is it likely that we would do our windows before our roof? We might put a higher priority on the roof, and so bring it a bit earlier and push the windows off a bit later, or some other set of circumstances. It might make more sense to make sure that your water main replacement is done in one of the cycles of asphalt repair and that sort of thing. So those sorts of fine-tooth smoothing out of expenditures can happen. And all of that sets out your annual spending. Well, once you know your annual spending, then you can build a cash flow plan that accommodates always having enough money to spend that. Now, of course, in times of low spending, you end up building your reserve. And in times of high spending, if it's higher than your contributions, you'll slowly deplete your reserve. But never should your reserve fall below zero. And in fact, I don't know a single reserve fund planner that doesn't recommend a cushion of at least $500 to $1,000 per unit, because it's a prediction, it's not a guarantee. So once you have that in place, then you have the basis for your notice of future funding. It goes out to all the current owners and forms part of the status certificate, so that any potential buyer can also review it and see it. And so it's important that it be a steady plan, well thought out, capable of actually covering the costs that are likely to be incurred over the next minimum 30 years. There is a movement to have that changed to 45 years. And I mentioned that, many people in the industry are looking at 60 and 100-year plans. So that's what a reserve fund study is. You have to do it every 3 years. It has to be done by an independent professional. Those professionals are called in the Act, I forget what the name is, but it's quite funny in these modern times that we should use that phrase. But anyway, there's 8 of them: engineers, architects, engineering technologists, and architectural technologists. They all govern themselves to other laws that govern their behavior, and certified reserve planners, graduates of Ryerson Building Science Program, the appraisers at the Appraisal Institute, and quantity surveyors. So of those 8 classes, that's it, classes of individuals. I don't know why they're considered a separate class, but I guess because they lobbied hard to get into the act. Those 8 classes are allowed to perform them. I'll tell you right now, the vast majority are done by engineering firms, followed closely by certified reserve planners. And that's all well and good. There's a few other, tricky little details in there about reserve fund planning, but, like, should a $500 expense be in a reserve plan or not? Just always look at it at the high level. Are we doing a replacement or a major repair related to a common element? And if the answer is yes, then it belongs in your reserve fund plan.
All right. So the reserve fund is the money. The reserve fund plan is the plan for the next 30 years that gets done every 3 years, updated every 3 years. Thanks, John. So we had a question in the chat from Greg looking for some advice on how to bring owners up to date on what's happening in the world, particularly when your owner base is not highly engaged in understanding the building, but of course, complain bitterly about any fee increases. We have done a summary of environmental factors to share as part of our budget and reserve fund study update, but would appreciate any other advice. So let's start with the property managers. What are some suggestions you have in terms of bringing owners up to date? Go ahead, Jeff.
Couple of things that work really well for a lot of our clients, including an article about it in routine communication. If the corporation does a newsletter, that's a great space for it. Bulletin boards in the building if they exist, and even include some of the articles from some of the known sources, Remy Network, CCI, ACMO, and so on. There's lots of them out there that speak to these things, and it's a great common theme. A lot of newspapers even or media outlets, CTV and City TV have recently done a number of stories on this topic. The other thing that works really well to engage the owners is the town hall meeting, especially if there's a large project coming up and it's going to require either a special assessment or an increase in fees to bolster the reserve. But also as far as planning and setting expectations, town hall meetings are great to engage the owners, let them know what's happening, why it's happening, how it's going to take place, and estimated schedule and what challenges might be faced that could impact those things. Those are great things. John mentioned something in his discussion earlier that I wanted to touch on if there's a moment here, and that is,
go for it.
Don't always select the cheapest price. We see a lot of times where our clients on smaller projects where a consulting engineer isn't involved will often pick the lowest bid on a project, and more times than not, that's the wrong decision. Have some faith in your property manager and listen to their recommendations, because they generally have a better understanding of the contractors in the area and what their abilities are and what their reputation is like. We've taken on a few clients recently that have had work done in the past and typically chose the lowest price contractor to complete the work, and now we have engineers involved to assess the poor workmanship that's led to failures in the building envelope and hundreds of thousands of dollars in leakage because they cut corners on some replacements in the past.
Thanks, Jeff. Debbie agreed with you about the town hall. She put that in the chat. Do any of the other property managers have any other ideas in terms of how do we educate owners?
I'm going to say also seminars. I mean, we have held them over the time. We're due for another one. Is property management companies also holding seminars with relation to what's current in the world, what the problems are that we're facing in condo management. So not just waiting till it's specific about the condo per se, but educating along the way, whether it's a quarterly webinar that you hold for your condominium clients and educate on different topics so they can feel informed before it's a rush decision on a certain topic, is educate in advance. A little bit of preventative maintenance, so to speak, is understanding concepts and why things happen. And agree, of course, with my colleagues, is the town halls are fantastic for this. I think that if you over communicate, no owner can ever come back to you and say, I didn't know. So at the end of the day, if you've communicated in every avenue you can, then you're protecting yourself, your clients, your corporation.
Thanks, Jessica. Speaking of webinars, encourage your owners to come to CCI webinars. Yeah. They're free of charge. If your condo is a member of CCI, all your owners are members of CCI, so they can take advantage of any of our educational events. So encourage them to come and participate. When you get notices of the upcoming webinars, send it out to your owners. Let them know that they can register as well. All right. So this last 15 minutes has gone by so fast. So I want to just run through the panel, get their final tip in 1 minute or less. And Jessica, you're on my screen, so go ahead. You start. What's your tip to leave us with?
I was just thinking about this as you said it. So I think my take home and tips are: ask questions. There's no silly questions. Do your due diligence. Plan ahead. Don't panic. Educate yourself, whether it's research you do yourself with professionals, with consultation, and do research. Do research as an individual, as a board member, as an owner. And really learn about what it's like to be part of a condominium corporation.
All right. Thanks, Jessica. Joanna.
I think Jessica listed everything for all of us, but definitely communicate and don't be afraid to ask questions. Communicate with the engineer during the process of doing the reserve fund study, and make sure to let them know, because I've seen it so many times, let them know what your plans are, whether you're planning to replace with a $10,000 garage door or a $40,000 garage door, for example. So communicate.
Thanks, Jeff.
Yeah, listen to the experts. Communicate is definitely key. Have a contingency for certain, mostly for funding, but also if the project is delayed and you need to make contingency plans for access and other purposes, and pack your patience. There's going to be delays.
Thanks, John.
A couple things come to mind, but I think my general tip would be twofold. On the operating side of the ledger, try and have a couple months of common expenses saved as a cushion, a buffer, a surplus of cash on hand, just in case something does come up that is really weird and wacky. You can address it out of operating quickly, and you're not going to be rushing to special assessment. For example, maybe you'll be incurring costs to discuss the need for a special assessment. Well, if you had a couple months of common expenses ahead of you, you'd be able to afford that communication. And secondly, don't hesitate to reach out to your reserve fund planner to find out, what is in that scope of work? How did they see the work getting done? And, talk to them about, effective ways of either doing the work early, doing it over a phased way, or possibly even deferring it or changing the scope of work if something can be changed. So, it should be the sort of thing that is a regular discussion back and forth. So look at your operating, look at the buffer in there, and don't hesitate to talk to your professionals, especially when it comes to reserve fund planning.
Thanks, Mina.
I would say with regard to contracts, anticipate that there will likely be price increases for at least in the foreseeable future, and deal with it through escalation clauses in your contracts, as opposed to getting into a headbutting match with your contractor, because at the end of the day, you're better off to negotiate a settlement as opposed to getting into a claim situation.
Thanks. And last but not least, Patricia, what's your tip to leave us with?
I would just say keep calm and carry on. We'll get there. Don't worry about it. We will. You got a lot of people on your side. If you've got, us and your teams, that's what you got to do. You got to do that work, but you'll get there.
Thanks, Patricia. And Debbie Dale, who's our past president and our chat master, she had a really good tip she put into the chat there. She said, don't forget your auditors, a great resource to leverage as well. And a lot of auditors are recommending a minimum contingency of 20% of the operating budget. So there's another relationship that you definitely want to build. Well, thank you, everyone, for joining us today. This has been an amazing webinar, first webinar for our fall season. So I want to thank all of our speakers. I also want to take this opportunity to thank our sponsors. So once again, you'll see their logos posted up there: Common Ground, Condo Law, Macintosh Perry, and Bayshore Property Management. You can go to our website and just click on their logos, and that'll take you directly to their website. Don't forget to mark your calendars for our upcoming CCI Huronia Fall Webinar Series. October 21st, we're going to be talking about difficult people or difficult situations. Definitely a webinar you're not going to want to miss. November 18th, we're going to talk about Can You Be Richer Than You Think? The focus is going to be on budgeting. And on December 9th, we have our case law update for 2022. We will have our panel of lawyers going through the cases from the courts and various tribunals, letting you know what the decision makers are saying. Don't forget, our lunch and learns are Fridays from 12 to 1:30. If you have any questions, you can send an email to admin@ccihuronia.com. A recording of today's webinar will be posted on our website shortly, probably sometime next week. Don't forget to join us on Facebook. If you watch these videos down the road and you're watching them on YouTube, make sure that you like, you subscribe, and you share them with others. And then in terms of upcoming events at our other Ontario chapters, I just want to point out that CCI Toronto and ACMO are having their conference. It's back in person in Toronto, September 30th to October 1st. You can go to www.condoconference.ca for more information. CCI Golden Horseshoe has their Enhanced Directors Course Part 7 on October 17th. You can go to cci-ghc.ca for information there. CCI Eastern Ontario, our friends in Ottawa, have their Ottawa Condo Conference from November 4th to 5th. You can go to cci-easternontario.ca. And CCI Grand River is doing a seminar on EV stations and condos. There was a question in our chat box about EVs. So if you're interested in that, October 27th, it's an in-person event in Kitchener. CCI Windsor is having their AGM on September 29th at the Harbour House. You can go to cci-windsor.ca. And that's it for this next month. We'll see you on October 21st, I hope. Until next time, I'm Sonja Hodis from the entire CCI family to yours. Have a great weekend. And don't forget that CCI is your condo connection.